Hey, welcome to Church Online. It's so good to have you with us in this lead up to Christmas. Isn't it so exciting? I'm guessing for you, as much as it is in my house, there's that rising sense of expectancy. There's that sense of excitement that's building as we get so close to Christmas. You know, I just love this time of year. I love everything about it. I love that sense of excitement. If you walk down the malls here, if you walk down the road from where our church is, all of the cafes, all of the hotels, they're just overflowing, and there's a buzz about them that's different from the buzz on a Friday or Saturday night. It's because this time of year people are relaxed, because they know that come Christmas they're going to get a break, they're going to be able to enjoy the summer, they're going to be able to rest and refuel, ready for whatever 2021 has for them. I know for some of you watching that you're in winter, and that's fine. It's a great season to celebrate Christmas in. I've never done it, but looking at the postcards and all those, I can imagine it would be really nice, that sense of being inside while it's cold outside, warm, and just relaxed and having fun with family and friends around the tree and around the table. It must be such a nice experience. But here it's summer and we are so ready for it. And I am so excited about this year because I have done all my Christmas shopping. I only have one person to shop for, and that's my wife. And gift giving is my love language, and so I love going shopping for her. It's a chance to show her how much I appreciate her, because I know I don't tell her enough, and it's my way of just saying, you know, I really, really couldn't live life without her. And I'm so thankful because, you know, my wife she's not a shopper, and when she does go shopping, it's never for herself, it's always for other people. Whereas I know plenty of people who it's not like that for them. You know, you can go to our malls and this is what you find. You know, increasingly, if you go to malls, they're putting out easy chairs like this in the woman's department, not for the woman to sit in, but for the poor husbands to sit in. Mall after mall, if there's a space at this time of year to sit down, you're going to find some poor husband who's been dragged around for the umpteenth time, going from this shop to that shop to this shop to that shop, and they're never buying a thing. And so you can feel sorry for these guys. Whereas I'm blessed, my wife doesn't do any of that sort of stuff, so it's good. I enjoy it. I just find I'm made for Christmas. I love everything about it, but it's not because of what is happening. I love Christmas because of what has happened. I love Christmas because of what it means, of what it tells me. Christmas gives me a chance to recalibrate myself, because it reminds me of who I am and my worth. Because Christmas isn't about all the parties and all of the shopping and all of the gifts and the family coming round and unwrapping presents. I love the joy on my grandkids' faces, but you know what? Christmas isn't about what's happening. Christmas is about what happened. It's about how 2,000 years ago, the Son of God gave up the glory of heaven and was born as one of us, to show us how important we are to God. To show us that no matter what is going on in your life or mine, that God is still in control, that He's still there for us, that He loves us, He cares for us, and He wants a relationship with us. You see, Christmas isn't just about that time that then God stepped down and split history into two, before Christ and after Christ. It's much more personal than that. Christmas is about reminding us of the significance in your life and mine of who we are, and reminding us and encouraging us and inspiring us to live out of the fullness of that. You see, in the busyness of Christmas, I want us this morning just to renew our perspective on what it's about and who we are as a consequence. You see, if you grew up in the church, or you went to Sunday school, you know that there are four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And just like Sesame Street, you know that song, one of these things is not like the other, one of these things just doesn't belong. It just seems in every group you're going to have one that's different. And amongst the four Gospels, you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, and then you have John, who's the odd one out. John is the one who just writes in a way we think, were you even there at times? Like, what were you watching? What were you listening to? What was going through your mind? It just seems so different to the others. But John was writing at the end of his life. He's looking back over his life. He's lived through the time of Jesus. He's given his heart to Jesus. He's recognized that he's the Messiah, the Son of God. And he said, no matter what, I'm going to follow you. And wherever that has taken him, he has followed. And now he's at the end of his life. And he's looking back, and it's like he's thinking, I've told the stories of Jesus hundreds and hundreds of times. But I'm the last one, and who's going to do it after me? And so he writes it down. And he's the one, as a consequence of that, is that he writes it down, and he looks back at not just his life, but the effect of the gospel in his life and the lives of everybody he knows. He's the one who reduces Jesus to one word. God is love. He says, everything about Jesus, everything about the gospel, everything about God's plans for us and what drives it, what motivates it, everything about God's concern in your life and mine, everything about God's involvement in our lives can be wrapped up in this one word, love. And isn't that a great thought to take into Christmas? That God is love. That no matter what's been happening this year, no matter what is happening in your life or my life right now, no matter the craziness that may be swirling around, God is love. And what makes this statement here so amazing from my perspective is the fact that John experienced things that our life experience doesn't really prepare us to fully enter into his life and his experiences. You see, John is writing at the end of his life, which means that he lived through some pretty tumultuous times. It means that he saw family members tortured and killed for the sake of the gospel. It means that he saw friends just brutally murdered. He saw armies come and just rip through whole cities and whole areas and just wipe people out. He lived through Nero, who was that despotic emperor who would light people up as human candles to light up the night sky for his dinner parties. He lived through all of this. He saw his entire culture reduced to nothing. And yet, even after everything he's been through, looking back at his experience and the experiences of others and seeing the way that the Roman Empire and others had really come against and persecuted those who followed after Jesus, and he'd seen this happen and that happen and seen closest people killed and everything else, he writes, God is love. Isn't that an incredible statement going into Christmas? God is love. You know, could you look back on your life as however much you've lived already and say, you know what? God is love. No matter what I've been through, no matter the relationship struggles, no matter the hardships, no matter the setbacks, I can testify with joy in my heart that God is love. John did. And John writes because he wants you and I to do that. You know, he writes after having seen Rome come and sack Jerusalem. They laid siege to it for over 7 months. They starved the people there. Over 1 million people died. Over 300,000 people were taken off to slavery. The temple was destroyed. And yet, as he's looking back over his life, he's able to say God is love. And at the end of his gospel, he writes this: Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. In other words, everything in John's gospel is just a taste, it's a glimpse into the fullness of who Jesus is. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, for John, because God is love, God gives life. For him, the two are the opposite sides of the same coin. If you're going to have life, then you must have love. If you're going to experience the fullness of life, you will experience love. If you can't live life without the love of God. You can't really experience everything that God has for you without that. And so as a consequence, he begins his gospel not with the birth narratives of Jesus like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And even that alone is surprising when you think about it, because remember when Jesus was on the cross, he said to John, "This is your mother." And he turned to his mother and says, "Mum, this is now your son." So that means that John looked after Jesus' mother. She went and lived with him, and everywhere John went, Mary went. Don't you think that she would have told him some stories about Jesus? He had insight and access to some of the things that the other disciples wouldn't have been privy to. And so he could have started his gospel with stories that would have just made him famous in that sense. And yet he didn't. He didn't start with the birth narrative. He doesn't begin with the angels. He doesn't have the shepherds and no room at the inn. He doesn't do any of that. He begins with the significance of Jesus' birth. He begins with the significance of Christmas. You see, when Jesus was born, in many ways, the world was a lot like it is today. You know, in terms of the political turmoil, and in terms of the instability that was around the world then, and we see it around us today, in terms of the strife that is evident around the world, and the way that conflict is brewing and is just simmering below the surface in so many countries. It's very similar to the fear and anxiety that we experience today because of COVID. They were experiencing for other reasons. And so John begins his gospel in a way that speaks into that. And he begins not with the birth of Jesus in the traditional sense, but he begins with a way that is so powerful. And because of its significance, it gives hope to you and I today. This is how he starts. In him was life. In him was life. See, as I said, he's writing at the end of his life, and he's looking back, and he's got perspective. And he realizes that of all the things that you may say about Jesus, of all the things you may want to say about Christmas, of all of the feelings that it may generate within you, in him was life. The moment Jesus was born in that stable, whatever it may have looked like, life, eternal life came about. Things changed, not just for Jesus, but for you and I and for the world. He's saying, when I look back at the tragedies, when I look back at my life, and I look back at the ups and downs and everything else, I can sum it up. And Jesus was life. And he goes on, and that life was the light of all mankind. Don't miss this. This is really important. This life, this is Jesus, was the light of all humanity. And we read that, and it's so easy to miss the significance of that, because when Jesus was born, the people of the day were looking for a Messiah for themselves. They were looking for a Messiah that would free a group of people. They were looking for a geographical, political type Messiah who would just look after Israel in the face of the Roman Empire that was threatening them. They were looking for a Messiah that would be for them. They were looking for a Messiah that would hear them as God had heard the Israelites, the Hebrews, back in Exodus, and dealt to their oppressors. So they were looking for something very particular, very localized, and basically just Jewish. But John, in his old age, as he looks back, realizes the significance of this life for the world, for you and for I. And he says, you know, the light wasn't meant to be just for a small group of people. It's for everybody. He could have written today, Christmas is not just about how you celebrate. Christmas is about taking the light of the gospel and sharing it with other people. You know, if you're privileged to be able to celebrate Christmas, he might say to you in the light of this, don't do it by yourself. Find whoever is by themselves, find whoever is in need, whoever is alone, and get them to come and to celebrate, because this light, this life is for everybody. And then he goes on in verse 5 and he says, the light shines in the darkness, and that darkness has not overcome it. He says, in spite of everything that has happened, the end of the temple, which represented the presence of God amongst God's people, and even in the midst of the persecution where people were, as I said, dipped in tar and set on fire, where they were beaten, whipped, crucified, where millions lost their lives, where hundreds of thousands were taken into slavery, where people were starved, where cultural forces were at work to overturn and deny people's identity and religious beliefs. And despite of all that, the darkness could not overcome the light and the life of Jesus. Caesar couldn't do it. Nero couldn't do it. Tiberius couldn't do it. Islam can't do it. Philosophies of this world can't do it. COVID can't do it. Broken relationships can't do it. Nothing can overcome the light of the gospel, the life of Jesus. John, 2,000 years ago, was writing to remind you and I that Christmas is not just a brief respite in the pressures of life. Christmas is about something greater than that, because he's saying the light has come and the darkness, the pressures, everything that you're experiencing right now cannot put out the light, the life that is for you and for me. You see, he's looking back and he sees how Jesus steps into the world and what happens when he does. And he says, I want people to know. I want you and I to know. He says, I want the people in 2020 to know that no matter what you're going through, no matter how bad the year's been, no matter how COVID has made you feel, no matter how isolated it may appear to be, no matter how anxious you are, no matter how desperate you may be, no matter how at the end of your wits you are, no matter how you feel, the darkness cannot overcome the light and the life of the gospel of Jesus Christ. No matter what is going on in your life or mine, no matter the relationship struggles, no matter the financial struggles, no matter that sense of isolation by distance, no matter the pressures of lockdown, nothing can overcome the life that came into the world that first Christmas. And I think that's a great thing for you and I to be reminded of. That the light and the life of Jesus is as much burning for you and I today as it was back then. Because when we recognize that, it reminds us that no matter where we stand, no matter what we're going through, there is hope. There is hope. You see, this is why for me, I'm made for Christmas. Because Christmas is about hope. Christmas is about the coming of the light and the life of God for your sake and for mine. It is about the coming of the gospel, of the good news, that we are profoundly loved, that we are profoundly cherished by the maker of the heavens and the earth, and that nothing we do can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. That he comes to give life that is eternal, and a light that cannot be put out. In other words, he comes to give you and I hope. And so as you prepare for Christmas, let's take a moment and learn from John's perspective. He's writing at the end of his life, and he realizes that through the ups and downs, through the hardships, through the trials, the tribulations, no matter what life brought, Jesus is light, Jesus is life. And that's why you could say Jesus is love. So why don't we just take a moment in the busyness of the lead up to Christmas and just hit the pause button. And why don't we just look back over the last year of our life, over the situations that have caused us anxiety, that have caused us to be stressed, that have made us wonder, does God care? Where is God? What is happening? Where's my peace? What's happened to my comfort? Why don't we look back over the year that's been, just as John looked over his life. And let's just take a moment and ask ourselves, what have we learned about ourselves? Why don't you get a piece of paper and just ask yourself, what have I learned about myself? Just make some notes. What are some things you've learned about yourself? through lockdown, whether it be here in New Zealand or overseas, it makes no difference. The nature of the lockdowns may have been slightly different, but because of that, it's forced us to examine our lives, to look at our lives, to look at what we've surrounded ourselves with. That's why we did that series, The Essentials. But you would have learned some things about yourself. You'd have learned that you could perhaps take more than you thought. You would have learned that you need people in your life you didn't realize you needed. You would have learned some things. What have you learned? Take some time and just write it down. Begin to take some notes. And what have you learned? And then ask yourself this: what have you learned about God? You see, John, looking back over his life, I'm sure that when he went through some of the hardships, his reactions initially were the same as yours and mine. But then as he got perspective and he saw God at work, he matured. And that's why he could say, no matter what's going on in my life, God is love. Because he learnt about himself and God through life. What have you learnt about God through this year? I was talking with some people here from ALC recently, and they were just telling me some of the things they'd learned about God this year, and about God's graciousness and God's faithfulness and God's goodness. For them, it came in a form that they'd never thought it would come. They'd always just assumed that God's goodness and God's grace would come into their lives through a provision of career and income to provide for their family and all those sorts of things. But through lockdown, they realized that God's goodness and God's grace was much bigger than that. And they began to realize that God was at work in their lives in ways they hadn't recognized. And now, as a consequence, their jobs and that they're not the idols, they're not the driving force for them, because they've fallen in love with God all over again, because they've seen Him at work in ways they were blind to, because they needed to first learn some things about life and themselves. Just like John. So ask yourself, what have you learnt about yourself? What have you learnt about God? And then ask this question: where do you get hope? Where do you need Jesus? Where do you need Jesus to step up for you? Where do you need Jesus to come through for you? And what would that look like? You see, when they were going through persecution, I'm sure that they would have thought that for God would have done something like He did in Egypt. When God came to the rescue of the Israelites in Egypt, he opposed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh paid a price. And I think it would have been very easy for the Christians, when they were being set up as human candles in Nero's garden, to think, God, you're going to move and you're going to strike Nero down. It didn't happen. And I can imagine what that would have looked like for them and how that would have turned their faith inside out. But as a consequence, they began to get past themselves and their own preconceived ideas of what hope looks like, of what Jesus will and won't do. And they began to just say, God, we trust you. We don't know what this is going to look like, but we trust you. And as a consequence, began to make room for Him in areas of their lives that they hadn't. And so history records how at those times, even though God didn't step in to defend them in the ways that they anticipated, God changed their hearts and they became on fire in ways they never anticipated. And God broke through and did something. I wonder, where do you need Jesus to act on your behalf? Maybe it's a relationship issue. Maybe you need God to step into a dream. Maybe you need God to do something that is deeply personal. Maybe you need God to do something in another area of your life. But where do you need hope? I would really love it at this time of year, in this season of hope. I know that the moment you drop a comment below, it sort of becomes out there for everybody, but I'd love to see where you need hope. I'd love to hear where you need hope. And if you can't drop a comment, email me, hamish@alc.org.nz, because I would love to pray for you. My commitment is that over the next 12 months, I will pray regularly for that area, because I believe that God wants to release hope. Because He is life, because He is light, because He is love, and darkness cannot put these things out. He wants to release hope into your life. I would love to hear what that may look like. But here's what's going to happen. As you step back and you think, what have I learnt about myself? What have I learnt about God this year? The areas that God is going to work and how He's going to do that are probably going to be significantly different to how you imagine them at the beginning of the year, because your perspective has changed. Like John, you're seeing things in a way that you never saw at the beginning. That's why I love Christmas, because it helps me get perspective, because it's not about what's happening, it's about what has happened. And darkness can't put that out. Darkness cannot take away what God has done for you and for me. No matter what people say, no matter what people do, they cannot take away, they cannot kill the reality of what God has done in my life through Jesus Christ. They cannot take away that hope, they cannot take away that life, and they cannot take away that light. And they can't from yours either. And so as we celebrate this Christmas, may your joy overflow. As you get perspective, may hope be reawakened. And as we go into 2021, may you be expectant for God to move in your life and through your life and the lives of others, just as He did with John. That when you come towards the end of your life and you look back, you might be able to join with John and say, God is love. Until next time, God bless.